A millionaire had twin sons. The problem was that they couldn't sleep at all until one day he came home from work and couldn't find his twin sons anywhere in the house. Tired of searching, he decided to check his office, but when he opened the door, he was frozen by what he saw, and that changed everything. The crisp autumn air bit at Elena's skin as she passed through the immense wrought iron gates. Every detail of the entrance seemed to whisper a word she only knew from a distance. Power. The mansion rose before her, not like a home, but like a fortress of stone and glass, silent and imposing under the pale moonlight. The numerous dark windows were like closed eyes, guarding ancient secrets and a recent sorrow. Elena clutched the strap of her worn purse, the only possession she brought from her world into this universe of opulence, and felt her heart beat erratically, a mix of fear and necessity. It's just a job, she repeated to herself, a way to provide for her little Lucas and pay the rent on their modest apartment. But as she pressed the polished bronze doorbell, a deep chime that echoed into the night, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The door opened before the echo faded, revealing a woman with a rigid posture, dressed in an impeccable uniform. Her grey hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the skin of her face taut, marking it with an expression of permanent disapproval. "Are you the new cleaner?" the woman asked, her voice as sharp as her gaze. This was Mrs. Holloway, the head housekeeper, and her presence exuded authority. Elena simply nodded, unable to form a response. That's when she heard it. First, a low, almost imperceptible sound from upstairs. Then clearer, a cry. It wasn't the ordinary cry of a baby, not for fussiness or hunger. It was a continuous, high-pitched, desperate wail that seemed to tear through the silence of the house and seep into every corner. And it wasn't just one. There were two crying in a painful synchrony, as if one echoed the other's pain. "The boys, they don't sleep," the housekeeper said, emotionless, stating it as an immutable fact. Like the color of the walls, she led Elena through a grand foyer where the marble floor shone like a mirror, reflecting a crystal chandelier that hung from the impossibly high ceiling, a cascade of light and luxury. Along the walls, oil paintings in gilded frames displayed landscapes and portraits of a family that seemed to belong to another era. The wealth here was palpable, an almost suffocating force. It was clear that the owner of the house, a man whose name she only knew from the business pages, was a billionaire, his fortune stretching across deals and investments she could barely imagine. Mrs. Holloway explained the tasks with surgical precision, pointing to the silver that needed polishing, the Persian rugs that required care, and the dark wood furniture that would not tolerate a single fingerprint. But Elena could hardly concentrate. The twins' crying was a constant, agonizing soundtrack. It was a sound of pure agony that activated a primal instinct in her, a maternal urgency that made her think of her own son. She imagined the two babies, so small and already carrying such great suffering. What could cause such pain in being so new? While cleaning the mahogany banister of the main staircase, the wail seemed to intensify. She closed her eyes for a moment, the smell of beeswax and lemon mingling with the atmosphere of desolation. She felt an overwhelming compassion, not just for the children, but for the widowed father, a man who, despite all his assets and countless possessions, couldn't buy silence and peace for his sons. The housekeeper had warned her not to go up to the second floor, where the bedrooms were a restricted area, but the sound called to her. It was like a magnet, a silent plea that passed through the ceiling and went straight to her heart. She paused, cloth in hand, and looked up at the top of the marble staircase, from where the crying descended like a cascade of pain. A force she didn't understand pulled her upward, an instinct that screamed louder than the housekeeper's stern voice. What if she went up? The temptation to climb the stairs was a physical force, a call that echoed in her chest, but the image of Mrs. Holloway's severe face and the memory of her own struggles kept her in place. Disobeying on the first day would be the end. With a resigned sigh, Elena returned to her work, scrubbing the cold marble until her own tired reflection stared back at her. In the days that followed, the mansion revealed itself as a place of stark contrasts. The order was impeccable, the cleanliness absolute, and the silence of the adults almost reverential. However, it was all shattered, at any hour of the day or night, by the incessant crying of the twins, Leo and Liam. It was a pain that seemed to permeate the walls, the air, the luxurious furniture. Elena learned the house's routine by observing from a distance. She saw the father, Mr. Sterling, a tall, broad-shouldered man who seemed to carry the weight of the world. He left early, immaculate in his expensive suits, his face marked by exhaustion and a sadness that all his money couldn't hide. Sometimes she would see him standing in the hallway, staring at nothing, his phone displaying stock market charts or cryptocurrency tickers, but his eyes were vacant. What good was a fortune that multiplied in stocks and financial applications if the peace of his home had vanished? He was a man who commanded a business empire, whose capital grew every second, but who was powerless before the tears of his own children. The nannies, two young women who worked in shifts, seemed like ghosts. They had deep, dark circles under their eyes and a constant air of defeat. Elena saw them try everything: bottles, lullabies, colorful toys that flashed and played soft melodies. Nothing worked. The crying persisted, a marathon of despair that had no end. Mrs. Holloway supervised everything with her eagle eye, distributing orders and maintaining the discipline of the house. She seemed to see the compassion in Elena's eyes as a weakness, a flaw. One afternoon, finding Elena paused for a moment in the hallway, her gaze lost in the direction of the upper floor, the housekeeper approached in silence. "Your work is down here. Focus on what you're paid to do. Feelings don't polish silver." The warning was clear, an invisible line drawn on the polished floor of the mansion. Elena swallowed hard and nodded, returning to clean a side table with renewed vigor, her heart tight from the coldness of those words. She tried to be invisible, to blend in with the furniture, to be just a pair of hands that cleaned and organized. But her ears couldn't shut out the suffering. On a Thursday evening, as she was finishing cleaning the vast living room, the crying from upstairs reached a new peak of agony. One of the nannies ran down the stairs, her face streaked with tears, and went straight to the kitchen. The door to the children's room must have been left ajar. Elena was picking up some toys left on the rug when a movement at the top of the stairs caught her attention. It was Leo, one of the twins. He had crawled out of the room, his little face red and swollen from crying. He dragged himself dangerously close to the first step. Elena's heart froze. No one was around. In a second, instinct spoke louder than fear. She dropped everything and ran, taking the stairs two at a time, the sound of her own heart drowning out the baby's cries. She reached him just as his small body was tilting toward the marble abyss. With a swift, sure movement, she grabbed him, pulling him to her chest. The small, trembling body instantly nestled into her arms. And then, the miracle. The crying ceased. It didn't diminish. It didn't turn into a sob. It simply stopped. The silence that followed was so profound and sudden that it seemed to echo through the entire house. Leo lifted his teary eyes to her, and a long sigh escaped his tiny lungs. He buried his face in Elena's shoulder, and in less than a minute, he was asleep. Elena remained motionless, petrified, feeling the warmth of the small body and the gentle rhythm of his breathing. Hot tears streamed down her face. That's when she heard a sound behind her, a sharp gasp, full of astonishment and fury. As she turned, her blood ran cold. Mrs. Holloway was standing at the foot of the stairs, her eyes fixed on her and the sleeping baby, her mouth open in an expression of pure disbelief. The silence on the staircase was thick, heavy with the tension emanating from Mrs. Holloway. Her eyes, once merely severe, now flashed with something Elena couldn't decipher. Was it anger, shock, or a strange kind of envy? For an eternal moment, the two women remained paralyzed, one at the top of the stairs, cradling a sleeping miracle, the other at the bottom, witnessing the impossible. The housekeeper was the first to break the spell. She ascended the steps slowly, her sensible shoes making a dry, rhythmic sound on the marble, each step heightening Elena's anxiety. Her heart was out of control. She was sure she would be fired on the spot, accused of overstepping every imposed boundary. She braced for the worst, for the humiliation of being thrown out of the house that, for a brief moment, had seemed like a refuge. "Give me the boy," Mrs. Holloway said, her voice low but firm as steel. The order was unquestionable. With infinite care not to wake little Leo, Elena transferred the baby into the housekeeper's arms. Leo whimpered, wrinkled his tiny nose, but continued to sleep, exhausted. Mrs. Holloway held him competently but mechanically, without the instinctive warmth Elena had offered. She looked at the child's serene face, and for a fraction of a second, the rigid mask on her own face seemed to falter, but it was only an instant. "Get back to your work," she ordered, without looking at Elena. "And this never happened. You did not come up here. You did not touch him. I was the one who found him. Do you understand?" The threat was implicit, heavy, and undeniable. Elena just nodded, her throat too dry to make a sound. She descended the stairs, her legs trembling, her body cold despite the exertion. Back in the living room, she tried to resume her tasks, but her hands wouldn't obey. She stared at the cloth in her hand as if it were a foreign object. What had just happened? What magic had made little Leo surrender to sleep in her arms? As she stored the cleaning supplies in her closet, the other twin, Liam, who had stopped crying for a few minutes, resumed his lament from upstairs. It was a weaker, lonely sound, as if he missed his brother in their duet of pain. Elena felt a tightness in her chest, an almost uncontrollable urge to go back, to try to calm the other child. But the housekeeper's warning echoed in her mind. She was just the cleaner, an invisible cog in the machinery of the mansion. That night, on the way to her apartment, Elena couldn't stop thinking about the twins. That moment on the stairs had marked her deeply. The feeling of having that helpless, sleeping being in her arms had awakened a tenderness she had kept guarded, protected since her painful divorce. When she arrived, she found her 5-year-old son, Lucas, drawing on a yellowed sheet of paper, sitting on the front stoop. His little eyes lit up when he saw her. "Mommy!" he shouted, running into her arms. Elena hugged him tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of his hair, a mix of cheap shampoo and city dust. That hug was her safe harbor, the only real wealth she possessed. Later that night, after Lucas fell asleep, she took out her old notebook, the same one where she jotted down expenses and broken dreams, and wrote about what had happened. She described the weight of little Leo's body in her arms, the softness of his breath on her neck. She told no one, not even her only friend in the building. It was her secret, a moment of pure, inexplicable connection in the midst of a life of invisibility. The next day at the mansion, Mr. Sterling seemed different. There was a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. He stopped Elena in the hallway, something he had never done before. "Mrs. Holloway told me that Leo slept for almost 4 straight hours last night," he said, a faint smile curving his lips. It was the first time in months. He looked at her with a confused gratitude, as if she were somehow part of that small miracle. She has a way with them," he continued, clearly referring to the housekeeper. Elena felt a pang of something she couldn't name. She just lowered her head and murmured, "I'm glad, sir." He continued on his way, but the brief encounter left Elena unsettled. The secret imposed by Mrs. Holloway now weighed like a stone. The pattern, however, was destined to repeat. The following evening, as Elena was cleaning the library, she again heard the desperate crying. This time, it was Liam, and, as if drawn by an invisible force, he too appeared, crawling down the upstairs hallway. His cries were louder, sharper. Eleanor looked around. No one. The nannies were in the kitchen, the housekeeper in her office. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. Mrs. Holloway's order was clear, but the sound of that suffering was unbearable. Ignoring it felt like a greater cruelty than any risk of being fired. Her decision made, she went up the stairs, her body moving on pure maternal instinct. At the top, she saw little Liam, his face contorted in pain. She knelt and, without a word, held out her arms. The baby crawled to her and nestled into her lap as if it were the only safe place in the world. And again, like magic, the crying stopped. Silence once more filled the house. Elena rocked him gently, humming a lullaby her mother used to sing to her, a simple, ancient melody about stars and guardian angels. Liam fell asleep, his little head resting on her shoulder. She stayed there, lost in time, until a creak on the floorboard made her turn. Standing in the doorway of his study, his face pale and his eyes wide, was Mr. Sterling. He had seen everything. Time seemed to freeze. Arthur Sterling remained motionless in the doorway, the leather briefcase in his hand, forgotten at his side. His expression was a blank canvas on which a whirlwind of emotions was painted in slow motion. First disbelief, then confusion, and finally a profound wonder that softened the hard lines of his tired face. He said nothing. He just watched the scene before him, as if trying to decipher an impossible equation. There was the woman he barely noticed, the silent cleaner who moved like a shadow through his house, and in her arms, his son Liam slept with the serenity he hadn't seen in months. The silence was so complete, so precious, that Arthur feared he would break it with his own breath. Elena, meanwhile, felt panic rise in her throat. The adrenaline of being caught by her boss made her instinctively hold little Liam tighter, as if to protect him from an imminent threat. She expected a reprimand, an explosion of anger at her audacity. Her mind was already forming an apology, a fumbling explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, she didn't see a powerful billionaire, a master of business and the stock market. She saw only a father, exhausted and desperate, starved for the peace she now held in her arms. Arthur took one step forward, then another, moving with an uncharacteristic caution as if approaching a wild animal. He stopped a few feet from her and, in a choked voice, whispered the question that hung in the air. How? It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for help, a supplication. I don't know, sir," Elena stammered, her voice barely audible. "He was crying. I picked him up." She looked down at the baby's sleeping face, the soft skin, the long lashes resting on his rosy cheeks. He just wanted to be held, I think. The simplicity of that answer seemed to hit Arthur with full force. He, with all his wealth and vast assets, had hired the best specialists, bought the most technologically advanced cribs, filled the nursery with the most expensive toys. He had tried everything except the most basic, the most human, a hug. He moved closer and, with a hesitant gesture, touched Liam's head. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. A deep breath, almost a sob, escaped Arthur's lips. "Thank you," he said, and the word seemed to carry the weight of months of anguish. At that moment, Mrs. Holloway appeared in the hallway, drawn by the unusual silence. Seeing the scene, Elena with Liam in her arms and Mr. Sterling beside them, a look of gratitude on his face, her expression hardened. A shadow of displeasure crossed her eyes before she could mask it with her usual composure. "Sir, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice controlled but with an edge of steel. Arthur turned to her, and for the first time, Elena saw a glint of authority in his eyes that was not directed at business, but at the management of his own home. "Everything is more than all right, Mrs. Holloway," he answered, his tone soft but final. "It seems we've found the solution to the boy's problem." He looked back at Elena, and a small smile formed on his face. Or rather, the solution found us. The housekeeper said no more, but her silence was more eloquent than any words. She shot Elena a quick, icy glare, a silent promise that this wasn't over. The atmosphere, once warmed by a moment of connection, turned cold again. From that day on, something shifted in the mansion's dynamics. Arthur, discreetly, gave Elena a new, undeclared role. He didn't promote her, didn't change her contract, but his expectations were clear. When the twins started crying and nothing else worked, a glance from him was enough. Elena would drop what she was doing, go upstairs, and within minutes, silence and peace would return to the house. Mrs. Holloway watched everything from a distance, her jaw always tight. She saw her boss's growing dependence on this simple woman, saw the subtle power Elena was beginning to wield, and it ate at her from the inside. She had dedicated years to this family, managing the domestic estate with an iron fist. And now she saw her authority being undermined by a cleaner. The tension was an invisible fog that spread through the hallways. The other staff, sensing the change in the air, began to treat Elena with a mixture of respect and distance, as if she were both a blessing and a threat. One Friday evening, the routine was broken. Elena had to stay late to finish a deep cleaning. Her son, Lucas, who usually waited patiently for her at the entrance to their apartment building, wasn't there when she arrived, almost an hour late. Elena's heart hammered. A cold panic seized her. She ran back, calling his name through the dark, empty streets. The image of his smile, of his little arms wrapping around her, flashed through her mind, feeding an overwhelming despair. She retraced her steps, asked strangers, looked in every alleyway. Nothing. Then a thought struck her like lightning. A cleaning cloth. She remembered leaving a dirty rag in Mr. Sterling's office. It was a flimsy excuse, but her gut pulled her back to the mansion. She ran as she never had before, the air burning her lungs. When she arrived, she used the service key she'd been entrusted with and entered through the back, her heart in her throat. The house was silent, a different kind of silent. Not the tense silence of before, but a deep, peaceful quiet. She went up the stairs, softly calling Lucas's name. She went to the study and opened the door slowly, and then she froze. The scene before her was so surreal, so unimaginably tender, that her legs gave out. There, on the luxurious dark leather sofa, slept the twins, Leo and Liam, and nestled between them, with a protective arm over each one, was her son, Lucas. His small head rested on a cushion, his breathing soft and steady, in perfect harmony with the baby's. The three of them slept a deep sleep, a picture of pure innocence and peace. Elena brought a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Relief washed over her with such force she almost collapsed. But the sob escaped, and that's when she realized she wasn't alone. Peering through the half-open door, watching the same scene with an expression of absolute shock, was Mr. Sterling. That moment in the study stretched, becoming a private universe where only the soft sound of the three children's breathing existed. Elena and Arthur remained in their places, prisoners of a scene that defied logic and touched the deepest fibers of their souls. Elena's relief was so overwhelming that it mingled with a wave of shame and fear. Her son had invaded this sanctuary of wealth, had crossed an invisible but powerful social barrier. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed to have transcended any concern for protocol. His gaze held no judgment, only a reverent fascination. He watched the three small bodies nestled together as if witnessing a rare and precious event. an alignment of stars that had finally brought peace to his chaotic galaxy. He raised a finger to his lips, a silent request for Elena to make no noise, and entered the room with the lightness of someone treading on sacred ground. He approached the sofa and knelt, the expensive fabric of his slacks wrinkling on the Persian rug. He looked at the faces of his sons, Leo and Liam, and for the first time in a long time, he saw them completely relaxed. There was no brow furrowed in discomfort, no fists clenched in agony. Their little faces were serene, their mouths slightly open, surrendered to a sleep that seemed healing. And the cause of that peace was there between them, a boy he had never seen before, whose dark, tousled hair contrasted with the almost white blonde of his twins. Lucas, in his sleep, looked like a little guardian angel, an unlikely keeper of his son's tranquility. "Is he your son?" Arthur whispered, his gaze still fixed on the children. Eleanor, who had approached hesitantly, could only nod. The tears she'd been holding back began to roll down her face. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know how he got in. I was late. He must have been looking for me. I'm so sorry." "Don't," Arthur interrupted her, his voice low but firm. "Don't apologize." He stood up and turned to her. The soft lamplight illuminated his face, revealing a vulnerability that made him more human than any of his dividend reports or stock charts. "Please, don't apologize. This," he gestured toward the sofa, "this is a miracle." At that moment, Mrs. Holloway appeared at the door, her face a mask of controlled indignation. She had been drawn by the movement, and upon seeing the scene, her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. "Sir, what is this child doing here? This is an unacceptable breach of house rules. Children from the outside can bring diseases." The word diseases was uttered with a contempt that made it almost a slur. She looked at Lucas as if he were a contaminant, a piece of dirt that needed to be removed immediately. The comment shattered the moment's spell. Arthur straightened up, and the softness in his face was replaced by a cutting coldness. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, his tone low, but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "This boy has brought something into this house that neither I, nor you, nor a team of specialists have managed to bring in months. He brought silence. He brought peace. Therefore, he stays where he is." He turned to Elena, his expression softening again. "He can sleep here tonight, and so can you. There's a guest room down the hall. I'm not risking waking them." The decision was final. The housekeeper went pale with fury but dared not object. She shot a venomous look at Elena, a promise of future retaliation, and retreated in a furious silence. Elena, stunned, didn't know what to say. Sleep here, in this mansion that felt like another planet. The idea was absurd, but looking at Lucas's peaceful face, nestled between the twins, made her realize she had no choice. Arthur led her to a room that was larger and more luxurious than the entire floor of the apartment building where she lived. "Get some rest," he said, before closing the door. "We'll talk in the morning." But Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the four-poster bed, her heart a confusion of gratitude, fear, and bewilderment. What was happening to her life? The door to her simple, predictable world had been thrown wide open, revealing a complex and dangerous universe. Mr. Sterling's kindness was a balm, but the hatred in Mrs. Holloway's eyes was a real threat. The housekeeper wasn't just an employee, she was the guardian of this domestic empire, the woman who knew all the family's secrets, who managed the house's liabilities and assets with the precision of a fund manager. And she, Elena, was now an anomaly, a foreign element upsetting the established order. The gears of Mrs. Holloway's plan began to turn that very night. Discreetly, she began to sow discord. She commented to the cook about the strange influence the cleaner seemed to have over the boss. She insinuated to the gardener that the constant presence of the poor boy could be a dangerous distraction. They were whispers, small drops of poison spread with care. She knew a direct confrontation would be useless. She had to be subtle. She needed to plant doubt in Arthur's mind, to feed his insecurities as a father and as a man of his standing. She began to spread the rumor that Elena was taking advantage of the situation, using her own child and the twins' fragility to gain his trust and perhaps a piece of the family's immense fortune. Excessive emotional proximity can confuse the children, she told Arthur the next morning, in a tone of false concern. They might start to see this woman as a mother figure. It could affect their bond with you, the only family they have left. The seed of doubt was planted. Arthur, already burdened by guilt and the pain of grief, was fertile ground for that kind of manipulation. He looked at Eleanor, who was having breakfast with Lucas in the kitchen, and a new worry began to form in his mind. Was he being reckless? Was he allowing a stranger to get too close to his children, to his vulnerable heart? The pressure began to build, and the miracle of the previous night started to be overshadowed by the shadow of doubt. He knew he had to make a decision, to set boundaries. But how could he push away the only person who seemed to hold the key to his children's sanity, and by extension, his own? The mansion, which for one night had found peace, now became the stage for a silent, invisible war. And Elena, unknowingly, was right in the center of it, the seed of doubt planted by Mrs. Holloway germinated quickly in Arthur's tormented mind. He began to watch Elena through a new filter, analyzing every gesture, every smile exchanged with the twins. The gratitude he felt warred with a growing fear, a paranoia that the housekeeper might be right. What if this connection was just a stepping stone to hidden ambitions? The idea disgusted him, as his gut told him Elena's kindness was genuine. However, the business world had taught him to be skeptical, to distrust anything that seemed too good to be true. He was a man who had built an empire by deciphering people's intentions, calculating risks, and protecting his assets. And his sons were, without a doubt, his most precious asset, the living inheritance of his lost love. The pressure led him to take an action that seemed, at the time, the most sensible and prudent. On a grey afternoon, he called Elena into his study. The room, which on the night of the miracle had seemed like a refuge, now had a formal, intimidating air. He stood behind his imposing mahogany desk, hands in his pockets, his gaze distant. "Eleanor," he began, his voice devoid of the warmth of the previous days, "I need things to go back to normal. Your role in this house is cleaning. I'm immensely grateful for what you've done for the boys, but your interaction with them needs to be limited." Each word was a small blow. "From today, I ask that you have no more direct contact with them. The nannies and Mrs. Holloway will handle everything. I want you to focus only on your original duties." Elena felt the floor disappear from beneath her feet. She looked at him, trying to find a trace of the grateful father she had seen days before, but only found the distant billionaire, erecting walls to protect his emotional assets. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. The humiliation was a knot in her throat, but pride kept her standing. "Yes, sir," was all she could manage, before turning and leaving, closing the door softly behind her. The new rule was implemented with Mrs. Holloway's relentless efficiency. The routines were altered so that Eleanor was never in the same room as the children. If the twins were in the living room, she was to clean the bedrooms. If they were upstairs, she was restricted to the kitchen and service area. It was a cruel choreography. Elena could hear them. The crying, which had subsided to an occasional whimper, returned with full force. The high-pitched wails echoed through the house again, and every scream was like a needle in her heart. She felt powerless, a prisoner of her own compassion. The babies, in turn, seemed to feel her absence. They refused bottles from the nannies, pushed away toys, and sometimes crawled to the door, crying and looking down the hallway, as if searching for her. The mansion reverted to being a place of anguish, Arthur, locked in his study, heard the crying and felt the weight of his decision on his conscience. He convinced himself he was doing the right thing, a necessary protective measure. But the sound of his children's suffering was a powerful argument against his cold logic. While the Cold War settled into the mansion, Elena's world outside began to crumble. The principal of the modest public school Lucas attended called her in for a meeting. "Ms. Elena," said the woman, a lady with thick glasses and a weary air. "Lucas has been arriving late frequently, and he seems distracted, sad. If the tardiness continues, I'll be forced to take more serious measures, maybe even contact Child Protective Services." Elena explained her difficulties, her exhausting work schedule, but the principal was inflexible. The rules were for everyone, as if that weren't enough. At her apartment building, a next-door neighbor, a bitter woman named Sharon, who had always eyed her with envy for her job in the rich people's house, began to cause trouble. She complained about the noise of Lucas playing, about the hours Elena came home, about anything she could use as a pretext. The situation culminated on a Saturday afternoon. Elena had left Lucas playing in the small common courtyard for a few minutes while she ran to the corner store. When she returned, she found a police car and an officer from Child Protective Services, CPS, at her door. The neighbor had made an anonymous report of child neglect. Elena's heart stopped. The officer, a serious but fair man, listened to her story, saw the humble but clean conditions of her apartment and the way Lucas clung to her, and seemed to understand the situation. He gave her a warning, explained the risks, and informed her that a file would be opened. "Be more careful, ma'am. Next time, the consequences could be severe." Elena closed the door, her legs shaky. She hugged Lucas tightly, her body trembling with fear and anger. She was being attacked from all sides. The pressure was unbearable, threatened with losing her son at school, accused of negligence at home, and forbidden from following her most basic instinct at work. She sat on the bed with Lucas asleep in her lap, and despair enveloped her like a cold cloak. Maybe Mrs. Holloway was right. Maybe she didn't belong in that world. Maybe she should just give up, go back to her small town, to an even simpler life, but far from this web of intrigue and pain. She looked at the resignation letter she had started writing in her notebook. Perhaps it was the only way out. She picked up the pen, ready to take the final step, when her cell phone, an old model with a cracked screen, began to ring. The number was unknown. Hesitantly, she answered. The voice on the other end was panicked. It was Mr. Sterling's voice. "Elena, for God's sake, get over here. Now, it's an emergency." Arthur's tone was not that of a boss giving an order, but of a man on the brink of desperation. The sounds in the background confirmed the urgency. The twins' crying was different, sharper, interspersed with dry coughs and screams of pain that tore at Elena's heart. Without hesitation, she scooped up Lucas, who woke with a start, and ran out of the apartment building, hailing the first taxi she saw. During the ride, every red light felt like torture. Every second dragged with agonizing slowness. Her own personal crisis was instantly forgotten, overshadowed by the need to help those two helpless children. When she arrived, the mansion gates were already open. She ran up the driveway, Lucas in her arms, and found the front door wide open. The scene in the living room was one of contained chaos. Arthur was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking to a pediatrician in a tone of restrained urgency. The two nannies were trying in vain to soothe the babies, who were writhing in their arms. Their faces red and hot, Mrs. Holloway stood at a distance, her face pale, her composure shaken for the first time since Elena had met her. She seemed at a loss, her authority useless in the face of a crisis that couldn't be solved with orders or discipline. The twins had a high fever, refused to drink any fluids, and could barely breathe. "Elena, thank God," Arthur said, hanging up the phone as he saw her. There was such palpable relief in his voice it seemed to fill the room. He didn't need to say anything else. The barriers, the rules, the prohibitions, they all dissolved in the face of the emergency. With Lucas still in her arms, observing everything with wide, frightened eyes, Elena approached. One of the nannies, nearly crying with frustration, practically handed her little Leo. The baby's body was rigid with tension and burning with fever. The world around Elena seemed to fade away. She had eyes and senses only for little Leo, whose small body trembled in her arms. Instinctively, she nestled him against her chest, the same gesture she had used on the staircase weeks ago. She murmured soft words, a melody without lyrics, just the comforting sound of her voice. She began to walk around the room with slow, rhythmic steps, rocking him gently. Lucas, still in her other arm, watched the sick baby with a seriousness unusual for his age, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Gradually, the rigidity in Leo's body began to yield. His labored breathing started to calm, becoming deeper. He stopped struggling and, exhausted, rested his hot head on Elena's shoulder. The high-pitched cry turned into a low whimper and finally into silence. Arthur, watching the scene with bated breath, motioned to the other nanny. With evident relief, she handed Liam to him, but the second twin, seeing his brother in Elena's arms, reached out his little arms toward her, a mute, desperate appeal. Elena's heart broke. She looked at Arthur, who understood immediately. Carefully, he helped her sit on the edge of the large sofa and placed Liam in her other lap. Now she held them both, one on each side, with Lucas squeezed between them. It was an unlikely picture, the humble cleaner, with her simply dressed son, at the center of an island of calm, surrounded by a sea of wealth and desperation. And once again, the miracle happened. Liam, just like his brother, calmed down upon feeling her warmth and scent. Both babies, finally quiet, fell into a deep sleep in her lap. The fever didn't magically disappear, but the stress aggravating it dissipated. The silence that settled in the room was almost sacred. The nannies looked at each other, astonished. Arthur sat down in the armchair across from Eleanor, his body finally relaxing. He couldn't take his eyes off her, off the way she cared for his sons with a naturalness no one else possessed. It felt as if she were the missing piece, the melody that harmonized the chaos of their lives. Mrs. Holloway, however, watched it all from her post near the door, and her face showed not relief, but a cold, calculating fury. To her, this scene wasn't a miracle. It was the confirmation of her defeat, the final proof of the unacceptable influence this woman had on the family. While her boss saw salvation, she saw a usurper, and it was in that moment of silent rage that a plan began to form in her mind. A cruel, definitive plan that would remove Elena from this house forever. She needed something irrefutable, an accusation that would destroy the trust Arthur placed in Elena, an accusation of theft. The pediatrician arrived minutes later and, finding the twins calm and sleeping, was able to examine them without difficulty. It was a bad virus, but keeping them calm was essential for their recovery. "Whatever you did to calm them down, keep doing it," he told Arthur, glancing at Elena. "Their emotional state is half the battle." In the days that followed, the prohibition was forgotten. Elena became the twins' primary caregiver. She prepared their bottles, gave them their medicine, and spent hours holding them, singing lullabies. Lucas, who accompanied her, became the baby's little guardian. He would play on the rug near them, show them his old toy cars, and sometimes just sit beside them, watching them sleep. The mansion began to breathe again. The heavy air of sadness was replaced by an atmosphere of tranquility. Arthur, for the first time in months, was able to work from home without being interrupted by crying fits. He saw his sons, not just recovering from their illness, but thriving. They started to smile, to babble, to interact, and all of it seemed to emanate from Elena's serene presence. Mrs. Holloway watched the transformation with growing resentment. Under the guise of needing to organize the late Mrs. Sterling's jewelry, she gained access to the safe in the master bedroom. Her eyes scanned diamond necklaces, emerald rings, veritable fortunes in precious stones. But she wasn't looking for something of great financial value. That would raise suspicion. She was looking for something with sentimental value, something Arthur would recognize immediately, but whose disappearance wouldn't justify a security alarm. She found what she wanted, a delicate gold necklace with a small angel pendant. It had been the first gift Arthur had ever given his wife. It was a discreet piece, but of inestimable value to him. On Thursday night, while Eleanor was tidying up the kitchen before leaving, the housekeeper acted. With surprising agility, she slipped into the small staff locker room where Eleanor kept her purse. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a cold determination. She opened Elena's worn bag, and with her fingertips, as if touching something unclean, she let the angel necklace drop into a side pocket. She closed the purse and left, unseen by anyone. The stage was set. The next day, she would wait for the right moment, when everyone was present, to make her accusation. She envisioned the scene, Elena's humiliation, the disappointment on Arthur's face, her own reassertion as the only trustworthy person in that house. She felt no guilt, only the twisted conviction that she was protecting the natural order of things, defending the family's assets and memory against an intruder. What she didn't know was that her cruelty was about to trigger a series of events that would reveal truths far deeper than a simple stolen necklace. The storm was gathering, silent and relentless. Friday morning arrived with a pale sun that did little to warm the chill that had once again settled in the mansion. It was no longer an atmosphere of crisis, but a tense calm, like the silence before a storm. Eleanor felt an inexplicable unease, a bad feeling hanging in the air. She attributed it to accumulated fatigue, to the emotional roller coaster of the past weeks. The twins were almost fully recovered, and the routine was slowly returning to normal, albeit with a new dynamic. Eleanor now moved between cleaning and caring for the children, a hybrid role that made her happy but also vulnerable. Arthur, for his part, felt divided. The gratitude he felt for Elena was immense, but the dependence his sons and he himself had on her was frightening. He was a man accustomed to being in control, to managing his business and his life based on logic and strategy. The emotional investment he was making in Elena was unknown, risky territory, an asset he didn't know how to measure. This vulnerability was the fertile ground Mrs. Holloway had been waiting for. She chose late afternoon to execute her plan, a time when Arthur would be home, the nannies changing shifts, and the cook busy with dinner. A moment with traffic and witnesses. She approached Arthur in his study with an expression of deep concern. "Sir," she began, her voice laden with false regret, "I hate to bother you with this, but something very serious has happened." He looked up from his laptop, where he was analyzing the profitability of some investment funds. "What is it, Mrs. Holloway?" "The late Mrs. Sterling's angel necklace. It's gone." Arthur frowned. "Gone how?" "I saw it in the safe just yesterday." "I know, sir, I did too. But today, when I checked again, it was no longer there." The implication was subtle but venomous. Only a few people had access to that area. The housekeeper then delivered the final blow. "Sir, I don't want to accuse anyone unjustly, but the only person who has been moving freely throughout the house, in every room, for the past few days, is Elena." The name hung in the air, thick with suspicion. Arthur felt a chill. It was impossible. The woman who had saved his children, who showed an almost saintly kindness. But the seed of doubt, planted days before, was still there, and the cold logic of a businessman began to whisper in his ear. What if the kindness was just a facade? What if this was all an elaborate plan to gain his trust and then take advantage of his wealth? "That's absurd, Mrs. Holloway." he said, more to convince himself than to reprimand her. "Check the security cameras." "I already have, sir," she lied with conviction. "There's a blind spot in the hallway near your bedroom. The cameras show nothing conclusive, but—" She paused dramatically. "I know it's a terrible thing to ask, but perhaps you should check her purse, just to be sure. For everyone's sake." The suggestion was repulsive, but the doubt was already eating at him. If he didn't check, the suspicion would linger. If he checked and found nothing, he would prove her innocence. If he found it, the betrayal would be devastating. With a heavy heart, he agreed. They called Elena to the living room. She entered, drying her hands on her apron, a tired smile on her face. She saw Arthur's serious expression and Mrs. Holloway's triumphant gaze disguised as concern, and her smile died. "Elena," Arthur began, his voice hoarse, "there has been a disappearance, an item of value. And to eliminate any suspicion, I need you to show me the contents of your purse." The request hit her like a punch to the gut. The air left her lungs. She looked from Arthur to the housekeeper, understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. The setup. It was a setup. "Are you accusing me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I'm trying to prove you're innocent," he replied, but his words sounded hollow. With shaking hands, she retrieved her worn purse from the locker room and placed it on the coffee table. She opened the zipper. Inside was her wallet with a few dollars, a lipstick, her apartment keys, and a crumpled drawing Lucas had made for her. Arthur, feeling like the worst of men, began to check the pockets, and then his fingers touched cold metal. He pulled out the gold chain, and the small angel dangled in the light, a symbol of love and trust, now twisted into proof of a crime. The silence in the room was deafening. Elena stared at the necklace, then at Arthur's face, where disappointment was hardening into a mask of coldness and pain. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to say she didn't know how it got there, to scream that it was a frame-up, but the words wouldn't come. Shock and humiliation paralyzed her. "I can't believe this," Arthur muttered, more to himself. The pain in his voice was real. The pain of having his newfound faith shattered. He felt like a fool. "Pack your things," he said, his voice now hard as stone, the tone of the billionaire firing an employee, not that of a grateful father. "I want you out of my house. Now." Mrs. Holloway watched, her heart exultant. Her plan had worked perfectly. "And the boy?" she asked, with feigned concern. "Take him with you," Arthur answered, without looking at Elena. Humiliated, silent tears streaming down her face, Elena went to the playroom, where Lucas and the twins were sleeping a peaceful nap. She picked up her son with a desperate care not to wake the other two. As she left, she didn't look at Arthur. She didn't look at the housekeeper. She just walked toward the door, the weight of injustice bowing her shoulders. As she crossed the threshold, one of Lucas's small hands, asleep on her shoulder, slipped free and, for an instant, touched the doorframe, as if saying goodbye to the place that, for a brief time, had been a strange sort of home. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate. Mrs. Holloway's victory seemed complete. The walk from the mansion's front door to the main gate felt like an eternity. Each of Elena's steps was heavy, as if her shoes were filled with lead. The world around her seemed distorted, the manicured trees and perfect flower beds of the estate mocking her desolation. She hugged Lucas so tightly he whimpered in his sleep, oblivious to the earthquake that had just destroyed his mother's fragile world. When she reached the street, the contrast was brutal. The silent luxury of that wealthy bubble gave way to the harsh reality of life. Eleanor didn't have enough money for a cab, so she began the long walk to the bus stop, her body aching from tension and her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The humiliation was an open wound, throbbing with every pitying or indifferent glance from passers-by. That night, in her cramped apartment, she didn't cry. There was a desert inside her, a void so vast that tears couldn't find a way out. She put Lucas to bed, tucked him in, and sat in the room's only chair, staring at the peeling paint on the wall, replaying the scene in her mind. The look of disappointment on Arthur's face hurt more than the accusation itself. She had begun to see him not as a boss, but as a man, a father struggling with grief, just like her. And for a brief moment, she felt they had built a bridge of understanding over the chasm that separated their worlds. Now, that bridge was in ruins. In the days that followed, the absence of Elena and Lucas fell over the mansion like a shroud. The silence, once a gift, was now heavy and oppressive, but it didn't last long. On the first night, the twins woke up. Their cries were no longer just of discomfort, they were of loss. They screamed a name they couldn't yet pronounce, but whose absence they felt in every fiber of their tiny bodies. They refused food, pushed away bottles, and writhed in the arms of the nannies and Arthur. The hard-won peace disintegrated in a matter of hours. The house reverted to a hell of incessant wailing. Arthur, exhausted and tormented by guilt, tried to convince himself he had done the right thing. The evidence was irrefutable. But the heart is a stubborn judge, and his whispered that something was terribly wrong. He would look at the angel necklace locked in his desk drawer and feel not the anger of betrayal, but a deep, confusing sadness. Mrs. Holloway tried, with renewed zeal, to restore order. She hired a new nanny, bought new musical toys, suggested a new type of imported formula that promised miracles. Nothing worked. Elena's absence was a hole that could not be filled with money or discipline. The situation came to a head a week later. The twins, exhausted from crying and not eating well, fell ill again. This time, it was worse. The fever returned, accompanied by a frightening apathy. They stopped crying and entered a state of prostration, their little eyes open but dull, like two broken dolls. Desperate, Arthur rushed them to the city's best hospital. They were admitted to the pediatric wing, monitored by a team of specialists, but the tests revealed no serious organic cause. It was, as one doctor put it, a case of acute stress. They were, quite literally, giving up. On the second day of their hospital stay, an older nurse with decades of experience observed Arthur's anguish. Her name was Alice, and she had a gaze that seemed to see right through people. "Sir," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "your sons don't have an illness we can cure with medicine. Their pain is in their souls." Arthur looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I've seen this before," she continued. "Young children form very strong bonds, sometimes with people who aren't family. A nanny, a caregiver. Did someone recently leave their lives? Someone they were very fond of?" The question hit Arthur like a fist. The image of Elena, with the twins asleep in her lap, flashed in his mind with painful clarity. "Yes," he admitted, his voice cracking. "There was a housekeeper. She had to leave." "Leave how?" Nurse Alice pressed, her perceptive gaze not letting him off the hook. Arthur hesitated. Telling the truth would make him sound like a monster, but his son's condition was more important than his pride. I fired her for theft." Nurse Alice showed no surprise, just a trace of sadness in her eyes. "Children this age don't understand theft or being fired. They only understand absence. To them, the person who gave them safety and love simply vanished. They feel abandoned, and their little bodies react to that. It's a form of grief." Every one of the nurse's words was a nail in the coffin of his guilt. He hadn't just committed an injustice, he had been cruel. He had punished not only Eleanor, but most of all, his own children. A terrible doubt began to haunt him. What if he was wrong? What if Mrs. Holloway's accusation was a lie? The idea was so preposterous he tried to dismiss it. Mrs. Holloway had been with his family for years. But the image of Elena's shocked and wounded face, her inability to defend herself, started to look less like a sign of guilt and more like one of pure disbelief. Seized by a sudden urgency, he left the hospital and sped back to the mansion. He needed proof. He needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. He went straight to the security room, the place the housekeeper claimed to have checked. He sat before the monitors and began pulling up the recordings from the day of the alleged theft, his heart pounding in his chest, praying he wouldn't find what he feared. And then he saw it. He saw Mrs. Holloway, during the lunch hour when the house was empty, slipping furtively into the staff locker room. He saw her emerge seconds later, a look of dark satisfaction on her face. The blind spot she had mentioned didn't exist. She had lied. She had planted the necklace. The truth hit him with the force of a freight train. He replayed the footage several times, incredulous. The betrayal was so deep, so calculated, it left him breathless. The woman he trusted most, the guardian of his home, had orchestrated the entire thing. Ashamed, disgusted, and heartbroken by his own stupidity, he knew what he had to do. First, he would fire Mrs. Holloway, and then, the hardest part, he would find Elena and beg for her forgiveness. But how could he find a woman he barely knew, whose only address was an anonymous apartment building in a city of millions? Arthur drove back to the mansion with a bitter taste in his mouth. The anger he felt toward himself was far greater than the anger he felt toward Mrs. Holloway. He had been blind, an arrogant fool who chose to believe a convenient lie rather than trust his own instincts. He had judged Elena by her social standing, assumed the worst, and in doing so had become the villain of his own story. He entered the house like a storm. He found Mrs. Holloway in the kitchen, overseeing the preparation of a soup no one would eat. "Mrs. Holloway, my study, now," he said, his voice so cold the cook took a step back. In the study, he didn't invite her to sit. He just stood, arms crossed, and looked at her with icy contempt. "I saw the security tapes, Mrs. Holloway." The housekeeper's normally impassive face lost all its color. For an instant, panic flashed in her eyes, but she quickly replaced it with a mask of indignation. "Sir, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," he retorted, his voice sharp. "I saw you plant the necklace in Elena's purse. I saw your lie." She tried to argue, to say he was mistaken, that the footage could be misinterpreted, but the conviction in his eyes was unshakable. Seeing there was no escape, her mask fell away, revealing the bitter, resentful face of a woman consumed by envy. "That woman didn't belong in this house," she spat, the venom finally surfacing. "She was bewitching you, taking my place. I have dedicated my life to this family, to the memory of Mrs. Sterling, and you replaced me with a cleaner." Arthur listened in silence, his anger giving way to an immense pity. She wasn't a monster. She was a lonely, insecure woman who saw her little kingdom threatened. "Pack your things," he said, his voice now just weary. "You have 1 hour to be out of this house. Your severance and a neutral letter of reference will be sent to you. Consider it a generosity you don't deserve." She looked at him, defeated. Without another word, she turned and left, the sound of her footsteps in the hall marking the end of an era. Alone, Arthur slumped into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The first part was done. Now, the hardest. How to find Eleanor. He didn't have her full last name or address. The cleaning agency that had hired her had vague records, as she was a gig worker. He spent the rest of the day and the following night in a frantic search. He called the agency, which promised to look through their files. He hired a private investigator, an expensive man who handled the secrets of the elite. But the hours ticked by with no news. Meanwhile, at the hospital, the twins remained listless. Nurse Alice would look at him with a mix of compassion and expectation. "Have you found her?" she would ask softly during each visit. The question became a torment. On the third day of the search, a break. The cleaning agency called. They'd found an old file with the name Elena Santos and an address for an apartment building in a working-class neighborhood in Queens. It was a lead. Arthur took the address and drove there himself, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. The building was old and run down, with laundry hanging from windows and the sound of many lives squeezed into too little space. It was a universe away from his Connecticut estate. A knot formed in his stomach. How could he have been so cruel to someone who lived here? The building's superintendent, a wary woman, informed him that Eleanor was gone. Left 2 days ago. Said she was going back to her hometown. Lost her job, poor thing. Had no reason to stay. Desperation hit Arthur full force. He was so close, yet he had lost her. Where? Did she say where she was going? Said she was taking the first bus upstate, somewhere near a town called Havenwood, I think. Her family's from there. It was a vague lead, but it was all he had. He got back in his car, phone in hand. He called his investigator. Forget the city. Focus the search on a town called Havenwood and the surrounding area. Look for a woman named Elena Santos and her son, Lucas, aged 5. Use every resource necessary. I don't care about the cost. Just find her. The search now centered on a small dot on the map. A rural town he had never heard of. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, but he wouldn't give up. The image of his sons, pale and lifeless in their hospital beds, was his fuel. He had to repair the damage he had caused. He needed a second chance, not for himself, but for them. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Elena stepped off a dusty bus in a small town surrounded by green hills. With Lucas by the hand and a single suitcase, she breathed in the clean country air, the scent of damp earth and grass. She was at the home of a great-aunt, the only relative she had left. It was a simple cottage with a small yard where chickens pecked at the ground. It was a new beginning, from scratch. She didn't know it, but the gears of fate, driven by the regret of a powerful man, were already turning in her direction, ready to connect their two worlds in a way she could never have imagined. The days became a form of torture for Arthur. Each hour was marked by a call to the hospital and the same bleak response. Stable arm, but no improvement. The twins had retreated into their own silent world, a hunger and affection strike that the doctors couldn't break. Arthur felt time slipping through his fingers. What good was all his capital, his skill at generating profit and dividends, if he was going bankrupt in the one venture that truly mattered? His children were fading, and the fault was entirely his. He spent his nights in the security room, no longer looking for betrayal, but watching the recordings from the happy days. He saw Eleanor with the twins, the tenderness in her gestures, the light she brought into the room. He saw Lucas showing a toy to Leo and Liam, the pure innocence of their interaction. They were scenes that stabbed him in the heart. On the morning of the 4th day, the investigator called. "We've found her, sir. A little town, Havenwood. Her great-aunt lives on a small farm on the outskirts. I have the address." Overwhelming relief washed through Arthur, followed by a wave of panic. What would he say? How could he possibly fix something he had so brutally broken? He didn't send an emissary, didn't make a call. He took the keys to his most discreet car and started driving. The journey was a pilgrimage. He left behind the skyscrapers, the digital billboards advertising crypto investments, and the chaotic traffic. The landscape transformed, the grey of concrete giving way to the endless green of the rolling hills. He had never ventured down these roads, into this America that existed outside his cash flow spreadsheets and investor meetings. After hours of driving, following the coordinates on his GPS, he turned onto a dirt road. The luxury sedan looked like an alien in the rustic setting, and then he saw it. A small white house with blue shutters, a little garden of wildflowers out front, and chickens roaming freely. Standing in the yard, kicking a ball made of socks, was Lucas. He was laughing, a pure, happy sound. And sitting on the porch steps, peeling oranges, was Elena. She looked thinner, her face etched with weariness, but there was a peace in her posture, a resignation that pained Arthur. She belonged here, in this sunlight, far from the darkness of his mansion. He got out of the car, the sound of the door closing, echoing in the country silence. Elena looked up. As she recognized him, her body went rigid. The smile vanished, replaced by an expression of shock and mistrust. She stood up in one swift movement and called to Lucas, who ran to hide behind her legs, clutching her skirt. She was a lioness protecting her cub. Arthur approached slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Elena," he said, his voice hoarse, "please, don't be afraid. I just need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about, sir," she replied, her voice cold but trembling. "You said everything you needed to say that day." "I was wrong," he said, the words coming with difficulty. "Terribly wrong. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I saw the tapes, Elena. I know it was Mrs. Holloway. I know you're innocent." He told her everything: the housekeeper's setup, her dismissal, the discovery of the truth on the security cameras. And then his voice broke. "But that's not why I'm here. It's not to clear my name. It's for my sons." Tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding welled in his eyes. "They're not eating, Elena. They're not responding. They're in the hospital, wasting away. The doctors call it stress, grief. But I know what it is. It's you they're missing. They need you." He took another step, desperation etched on every line of his face. "I didn't come here to ask you to be my employee again. I came here to beg you to save my sons' lives. I'll do whatever you want. A contract, a house for you and Lucas, anything. Money isn't the issue. The issue is that they are dying." The revelation about the twins' illness hit Elena like a wave. She put a hand to her chest, her heart aching. She looked at the man before her, a billionaire reduced to a panicked father, stripped of all his power. She saw the truth in his tears, the genuine agony in his eyes, but the wound of humiliation was still there, deep and painful. Trusting him again felt impossible. She looked at Lucas, who was peeking out at him with curiosity. She looked at the dirt road that represented her new life, her peace. And then she thought of Leo and Liam, two innocent babies paying the price for the mistakes of adults. The silence stretched on, filled only by the sound of the wind in the trees. The lives of two children were in her hands. Elena's dilemma was profound. Her self-preservation instinct screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself and Lucas from that world of pain and unpredictability. To go back meant reopening wounds, facing the possibility of being hurt again. But her mother's heart couldn't ignore the desperate plea in Arthur's eyes. The image of the twins, frail and sick, superseded her own pain. This was no longer about wounded pride. This was about lives. "I don't want your money," she said finally, her voice firm, breaking the long silence. Arthur looked at her, surprised. "I want respect," she continued, each word carrying the weight of her journey. "I want a fair employment contract, with hours that allow me to be a mother. I want a guarantee that I will never again be judged by my clothes, my home, or where I come from. And I want you to look at my son and see a child, not a problem." She paused, taking a deep breath. "And I want an apology, not for me, for him." She pointed to Lucas, who was still hiding behind her. "I want you to apologize for tearing him away from the only place he'd made friends, for making him watch his mother be humiliated." Arthur felt each condition like a deserved blow. He had focused on repairing the material damage, on offering assets. But she demanded something far more valuable: dignity. He walked closer, and to Eleanor's surprise, knelt until he was at Lucas's level. He looked into the boy's frightened eyes. "Lucas," he said, his voice soft and full of remorse, "I'm so sorry. I made a very big mistake, and I hurt your mom, and for that, I ask for your forgiveness. Can you forgive me?" Lucas looked up at his mother, who gave a slight nod, her eyes glistening. The boy, with the simple wisdom of a child, took a step forward and held out his small hand. Arthur shook it, a pact being sealed between two worlds. The drive back was quiet but not tense. It was a silence of reflection. Arthur drove, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at Elena and Lucas in the back seat. He no longer saw a cleaner. He saw a woman of extraordinary strength, with an integrity that put his own wealth to shame. They arrived directly at the hospital. Nurse Alice met them in the hall, and a smile of relief lit up her face when she saw Elena. She led them to the twins' room. The scene was heartbreaking. Leo and Liam lay in their cribs, pale, with IV drips in their tiny arms. Their eyes were open, but empty. Elena felt her heart stop. She approached Leo's crib, her heart pounding. "Hi, my angel," she whispered. "Auntie Elena's back." At the sound of her voice, something shifted. Leo's little head turned slowly in her direction. A flicker of recognition appeared in his listless eyes. Eleanor lifted him into her arms. The small body, previously inert, seemed to awaken. He hugged her with what little strength he had, burying his face in her neck. Lucas, watching from the doorway, walked over to the other crib. "Liam," he called in his small voice, "I brought my blue car." Liam reacted too. He reached a small hand toward Lucas. Arthur, watching it all, paralyzed near the door, felt tears stream freely down his face. It was like watching wilted flowers spring back to life at the touch of water. In the following days, the hospital witnessed a miraculous recovery. With Elena and Lucas by their side, the twins began to eat again, to smile. The bond between them was the most powerful medicine that existed. Elena's constant presence at the hospital, caring not only for the twins but offering a smile and a word of comfort to other mothers, did not go unnoticed. She became the soul of the pediatric wing. Arthur, for his part, kept every promise. He hired the best lawyers to draft an impeccable employment contract for Elena, with a generous salary, benefits, and most importantly, flexible hours. He rented a small, charming house for her and Lucas in a quiet neighborhood near a good school and his mansion. He wanted her to have her own independence, her own home. During this time, something changed between them. The employer-employee relationship dissolved, replaced by a cautious friendship built on mutual respect. He saw in her not just the savior of his children, but an intelligent, insightful woman. She saw in him not the arrogant billionaire, but a dedicated father learning to navigate grief and parenthood. When the twins were finally discharged, the return home was a rebirth. The mansion, once a mausoleum of sorrow, now felt different. Arthur had made changes. He put away the most painful photos of his late wife, keeping up the happy ones. He opened the curtains, letting the light in. The laughter of the three boys, Leo, Liam, and Lucas, echoed through the hallways. 6 months passed. Life found a new, happy rhythm. Elena was no longer the cleaner. Her official title was Child Welfare and Household Administrator, a position Arthur created specifically for her. But in practice, she was much more. She was the glue that held their makeshift family together. One Sunday afternoon, Arthur watched them from the terrace. Elena was in the garden, teaching the three boys how to plant sunflowers. The afternoon sun gilded her hair, and her laughter was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He realized the peace he had so desperately sought wasn't in silence, but in that sound. The net worth of his companies, the interest on his investments, the value of his gold and Bitcoin, none of it compared to the richness of that scene. He came downstairs and joined them. He sat on the grass, getting dirt on his expensive pants, and for the first time in a long time, he felt genuinely at home. He looked at Elena, and their eyes met. In that gaze, there was no longer gratitude or debt. There was the beginning of something new, a feeling that was sprouting slowly and with strong roots, like the sunflowers they were planting. The silent mansion had found its voice. The mansion's transformation was complete. Where silence and sterile order had once reigned, there was now the happy chaos of a house full of life. There were toys scattered on the Persian rug, tiny fingerprints on the window panes, and the constant sound of children's laughter echoing through the marble halls. The house, once merely a display of assets and a shelter for grief, had finally become a home. Arthur discovered a capacity for fatherhood in himself that he never knew he possessed. Inspired by Elena's patience and dedication, he began to actively participate in his children's lives. He learned to change diapers, prepare bottles, and most importantly, to simply be present. He started delegating more responsibilities in his businesses, realizing that the greatest investment of his life wasn't on the stock market, but within these walls. Meetings with fund managers were replaced by picnics in the garden, and analyses of market trends gave way to reading bedtime stories. He found a kind of profit that couldn't be measured in dollars or euros. The happiness of his children, Elena, in turn, blossomed. With the security of a fair job and a home to call her own, she could finally relax and let her warm, intelligent nature shine. Encouraged by Arthur, who saw her potential far beyond childcare, she began studying online, taking a business administration course. He saw her not as a dependent, but as a partner, someone whose opinion he valued, whether it was about the dinner menu or a new philanthropic project he had decided to start. Their friendship deepened, evolving into a serene, mature love built on a foundation of mutual respect and admiration. There was no grand proposal or dramatic declaration. Their love grew organically in the day-to-day, in the glances exchanged over the children's heads, in the late-night conversations where they shared their dreams and fears. It was a partnership of souls who had found in each other what they were missing. A year after that reunion in Havenwood, they were married in a simple, intimate ceremony in the mansion's garden. The only guests were Elena's great-aunt, Nurse Alice, and a few close friends. Lucas and the twins, dressed in matching little suits, served as the ring-bearers, stealing the show with their cuteness. The mansion that had once represented the barrier between their two worlds was now the symbol of their union. The story of the cleaner who married the billionaire might have sounded like a fairy tale, but for them, it was something